Thomas Smiley was finally able to enjoy his holiday home on the Hawaiian island of Maui. He and his wife Gail had been visiting the island for more than 14 years. His children and grandchildren spent many happy vacations there. Now, having retired the year before, Thomas was able to spend extended periods of time at Ka'anapali Shores in their condominium. Although Thomas was an extremely motivated man, having enjoyed a successful career as an optometrist in California, he was a family man at heart. He and Gail were high school sweethearts and had been married for 42 years. He had 3 children and 6 grandchildren. Thomas had owned 2 optometry practices with his business partner, and his hard work had now afforded him the luxury of spending quality time with his family. In May 2019, Thomas and Gail had traveled from their home in California's Granite Bay to Maui once again. They tried to spend as much time there as possible. Their friends and family had joined them multiple times before. Now, as their trip to Hawaii was drawing to a close, Thomas decided to take one final dip in the ocean. Thomas was an adventurous individual who enjoyed the sea. He was a proficient water skier and introduced his grandchildren to the sport. His best friend since 1976, Gary Texera, described Thomas as living at 1,000,000 miles per hour. His other passion was muscle cars, which he drove on tracks across the U.S. Although Thomas was 65, no one would ever know it, as he was so young at heart and still full of adventure. When visiting Hawaii, Thomas went scuba diving most days. He was an experienced diver, and the waters of Maui were great for spotting all kinds of marine wildlife. However, on that fateful day, Thomas didn't go out for a dive. Because he and Gail were due to fly home the next day, and you are not allowed to dive within 24 hours of flying, he decided instead to go for a swim in the ocean. He waded into the water right in front of the condo that the pair owned. Whenever Thomas wasn't out on the dive boats, he would regularly swim from that particular beach. It was so convenient being right next to their apartment, and it was a lovely stretch of coastline. Often Gail would look out over the beach and see her husband swimming in the water. That morning was no different. But officials at the Department of Land and Natural Resources had made a terrible mistake. Over the past few weeks, they had been tracking a tiger shark in the area. It was part of their research, determining the routes it took and the miles it covered each day. It had been tracked to the beautiful stretch of coastline where Thomas now took his swim. No warning signs had been erected on the beaches to alert people to the tiger shark's presence. If there had, then Gail believes that there is no way Thomas would have entered the water that morning. It was supposed to be the final swim of the holiday. It turned out to be Thomas's final swim, period. Thomas swam parallel to the beach about 60 yards out. There were others in the water and people walking along the beach. It was a typical morning on Maui when all of a sudden Thomas felt a shark tug on his left leg and was instantly pulled under the water. In the few seconds that followed, he wasn't sure what happened. Then came the terrifying realization that he was being attacked by a shark. It was a tiger shark, and not just a tiger shark. It was the tiger shark that had been tracked by wildlife experts. It shook its head furiously from side to side, and Thomas was whipped through the water with it. He scrambled for the surface and took in a lungful of air before crying out for help. His cries were heard by those on the beach who turned to watch the terrifying attack unfold. His cries were also heard by Gail. She was in the condo. She stepped outside the doors and looked out over the water. When she had heard the cries, she assumed that a snorkeler had spotted a sea turtle and was shouting out of excitement, as had happened many times before. But when she looked out over the water, she saw a commotion. There was somebody splashing about, shouting as they bobbed under the water again and again. Gail's immediate thought was that somebody was in trouble with the currents and struggling to swim. At least it wasn't Thomas, because he was a very proficient swimmer, she thought. She could see members of the public standing on the beach, pointing out at the swimmer. Tragically, however, unbeknown to Gail, she was watching her husband being devoured by a large tiger shark. It continued to pull Thomas under the surface, and he tried to punch it and kick it with his other leg. His wrist was ripped to shreds as he lashed out again and again at the enormous beast. It was merciless in its attack. The hundreds of sharp, serrated teeth tore into Thomas's leg, and he felt the pressure building. He needed to break free. He needed to get out of the water, but nobody was coming for him. Eyewitnesses just stood and watched. Those on the beach could see the trouble he was in. Nobody wanted to risk getting into trouble themselves. Some had seen a fin arching out of the water, and it was now clear that the man in trouble was being attacked by a shark. Entering the water to help would be suicide. Somebody called the emergency services. No lifeguards had been stationed along that stretch of water. They had been too far away to respond immediately, but finally police jet skis were scrambled to the location. As they motored through the water, the salt spray flying into the air, Thomas felt his leg give way. The shark had completely bitten his leg off below the knee and swam away with it. Blood poured from his severed leg, and Thomas began losing consciousness. He had fought an incredibly brave battle. He had tried to fend the shark off, but the shark had been too powerful. Some tiger sharks can grow over 5 meters, 16 feet, and have a bite force of more than 300 psi. They rely on their serrated teeth to tear meat from their prey rather than their bite force to clamp down on it. But with that single bite and reluctance to let go, the shark had torn off Thomas's leg. He floated on the surface of the sea, surrounded by darkened water from his own blood. When the jet skis finally arrived, they pulled Thomas out of the water and rushed him to shore. Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were closed, and he didn't move. The police jet skis powered up onto the sandy beach, skidding to a halt. Gail was still watching the drama unfolding, still unsure of what had happened to this poor swimmer. As she brought her hand up to her forehead to shield her eyes against the bright sunshine, her heart missed a beat. She noticed that the swimmer they carried to the sand was wearing Thomas's swimsuit. It was her husband. Gail raced down the stairs and out onto the beach. She screamed as she ran towards the crowd that had gathered. An ambulance was already on scene, and Thomas was loaded up onto a stretcher. Gail reached his lifeless body. First responders were performing CPR on Thomas, but he was pale all over. The lower half of his leg was missing, and one of his wrists was torn open where he had tried to fend the shark off. He had lost too much blood in such a short space of time. There was no bringing him back. It was a terrible incident, and so sad for those who knew Thomas. As the family tried to come to terms with Thomas's tragic death, it was hard to comprehend life without him. He had been such a rock for the family and was simply adored by his 6 grandchildren. He had lived life to his fullest, seeking adrenaline in the sports that he loved, and peace from the loving family he had been surrounded by. Thomas was the 6th person to be attacked by a shark in Hawaii that year, although, sadly, he was the only fatality. The last recorded death by a shark off Maui was 8 years earlier, back in 2015 when a snorkeler was killed. Thomas had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Had he entered the water half an hour earlier or later, the shark wouldn't have been where he had been swimming. It was a tragic incident, and one that could have been avoided had people been warned about the tiger shark in the area. Instead, Dr. Thomas Smiley met his terrifying final affliction.